Have you noticed that the football manager market is a little bit weird right now? Bayern Munich can't seem to find a manager. Manchester United don't seem to know what to do with Ten Hag, and nobody's really getting fired. So what's going on? Well, I'm joined by Jon Mackenzie and JJ Bull to find out. So what do we mean by weird when we talk about the manager market?
Well, I think if we take a snapshot of the Premier League right now, it's quite obvious that there's something going on that's a bit outlier. So you can see from this graphic here, which is mid-season sackings over the last 10 seasons, this season, 23-24, is an all-time low over that time period. Now, if we go back to 2021, which as you remember is COVID season, that's the next lowest season. But from that point onwards, we can see that those manager sackings mid-season were trending upwards to the point where there was a huge amount of managers sacked last season. So clearly something is going on here. The big question is, why are managers being sacked less frequently? And so I think the best way to start answering that question is to look at certain flashpoints on the Premier League table where you might expect managers to be sacked. So one of them is the Champions League line. So top 6 teams that don't get into the Champions League probably spent a lot of money trying to get into the Champions League places, so they may be thinking about sacking their coaches. We've got, I think, 4 teams here just outside of the top 4 where there's been interesting things happening this season. So Tottenham Hotspur, if it wasn't Ange's first season, and if Spurs weren't giving the impression that they're doing more of a process approach to management right now, there's an argument to be made that he might be sacked at this point of the season. And then there's other teams below them where I think maybe money comes into it a little bit more. So Newcastle United doing all right now, but earlier on in the season, there was a point at which people were asking, should Eddie Howe go? But part of the problem we have here is PSR issues. So if you get rid of a manager, or you bring in a new manager, you can actually end up outlaying quite a lot of money.
And those are profit and sustainability Premier League rules, right?
That's right, yeah. So you will think twice, I think, about getting rid of coaches because it will start impacting the players that you can bring in. And I think a lot of clubs realise that, you're only as good as the players you have in your squad.
Chelsea, a pretty perfect example of that.
Yeah, because they still have managers on their books who don't work for them anymore, so they're paying out money for them. So a lot of money can be laid out in these situations. So it feels as though both Newcastle and Chelsea have just gambled on keeping their managers. And, it's clearly worked out because both of those teams have had optics in terms of their form more recently.
What about Manchester United? What possible explanation is there for this?
Yeah, I mean, Manchester United have had a generationally bad season. They are 8th in the table, and in many respects, they're lucky to be there. I think if you look at the underlying numbers, they're projected to be lower down the table, which is really quite bad. I don't think there's any manager at Manchester United previously who would have been able to have such a bad season and still be in the job, and yet he's still here. And there's even the outside chance he could still be there next season. There's certainly a non-zero chance that he could be there next season. They've got the FA Cup final. Who knows if they manage to win that? It seems incredible to say it right now, but there's a possibility that he could still be in the job at the end of the beginning of next season. So something weird is going on in the market, I think.
JJ, why is this happening?
Well, a lot of clubs in the Premier League are now quite smart, in fact, throughout all of football. And if you look at the Premier League and how the ownership of clubs has changed over the last 10, 20 years, it's very, very different. Because now I would argue that they aren't so much football clubs as they are multi-billion pound or dollar investments. Because whereas in 2000, every single club was domestically owned, now every single one basically, I think, is either partly owned or massively owned by private equity firms.
I like partly or massively.
Well, yes. And private equity firms.
Yeah.
Hedge funds.
Yeah.
All big words.
Yeah.
Or Gulf states.
Gulf states.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Not golf.
No.
So in order to make your asset an investment, to make it grow, you need to run it very efficiently and like a business. So rather than running it like a club, run it like a business, which means you put in people to make sure that there is cohesion to your strategy. So you bring in directors of football, technical directors, you start basing things on analytics and data, you bring in whole departments to make sure that this whole business functions as it should.
Horribly efficient.
Basically, as long as the club isn't massively underperforming, they tend to be absolutely fine. But even now when they're underperforming, because there's now PSR things in there is fewer reasons to get rid of them because you have to take all of this into context as part of your strategic decisions. And if you look at the relegation teams at the moment here, no one's really underperforming.
Yeah, that's really interesting also, John, isn't it? Because I assume around the relegation zone is the other hotspot for sackings.
Yeah, that's the flashpoint, right? It's clubs in danger of going down. And I think there's been a few outlier situations this season, one of which is the 3 teams that came up have largely been pipped for relegation the whole season. Luton, give or take, have flirted with getting out. But the other thing that's interesting is we've had Everton and Forest with PSR points deductions, which has meant that, for example, Everton have had a relatively okay season, but the points deduction makes them look much closer to the relegation line than they maybe have been. And so, Everton haven't really considered moving Dyche on. You've got Brentford just below Everton, who are the next team close to relegation. They've never really been that close, and there was a few weeks where it was like looking a bit sketchy, but they pulled a few wins off.
And you're never getting rid of Thomas.
Yeah, exactly. Brentford are a process-driven club, so they're going to be more careful about it.
Quick silent round of applause for Sean Dyche, I would say. By the way, I don't know if that's agreeable, but
full volume for Sean Dyche.
Well done to Sean Dyche. Come on, continue.
Even just breaking down, I think the bottom three teams is quite interesting because Sheffield United had moved on Paul Heckingbottom and brought in Chris Wilder, and it hasn't visibly moved the needle for them. But Burnley and Luton have interesting approaches to their coaches. So you've got Vincent Kompany at Burnley, who had a really good points total in the Championship last season. Luton Town, another process-driven team who I think would consider promotion last season to be ahead of schedule for their long-term plan, and so they're just treating this as an excuse to get some experience of the Premier League and keep the coach in post so that if they do go down, they'll be confident of yo-yoing back up. And so I think what we're seeing now is even teams coming in at the bottom of the table, much harder to jump the gap into becoming a solid Premier League side, but also having, I think, a lot more of a long-term view that actually what we need to do is have 1 or 2 seasons moving between the divisions to become a solid Premier League side as well. So all of which means that we've not seen as many sackings here as we might expect to. And I think if we go back to that graphic at the beginning, you can see that most of the teams who move their managers on are teams who are below 15th or below. And
all of them, I think.
Yeah, I think that because there's almost been a squeezing down of the clubs who are in danger of relegation, it's just meant that there's been fewer sackings as well.
I love that new approach to getting promoted and staying up, just doing it 3 times in a row, and then eventually, you pick your year. This is the one, lads. We'll go for it here.
Yeah, stick with a good manager who got you up. Then it means you're more sustainable as a business, really, because you're not constantly changing and all these assets are managed by a different person.
I remember Uncle Damien, a Norwich fan, telling me once that when Norwich went down with Daniel Farke, I think it was, as the coach, he was so happy that the club stuck with Daniel Farke because he was sick of having to sack a manager he liked every time they got relegated from the Premier League, which was every time they came up.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at all the teams now that are in the Premier League, all of them have, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but every single one of these managers is pretty good.
It's wild, isn't it?
Yeah, look at that, like Brentford, Thomas Frank, you've got Glasner at Crystal Palace, Sean Dyche there, Marco Silva at Fulham. All of these are linked with bigger clubs, Roberto De Zerbi, Andoni Iraola's doing very well at Bournemouth. So this is kind of what you're looking at here, and compare this to
we talked about Chris Wilder as well as an example of brought in a coach who hasn't really worked with Sheffield United, but he's hardly like a fuddy-duddy old school manager. He had he was playing inverted centre backs a couple of years ago, right?
Inverted centre backs and overlapping ones as well. Yes.
Oh yeah, they did both, didn't they?
Yeah, upside down centre backs.
Yeah.
That's what he was playing.
Yeah.
But if you compare this managers here, and again, this is where hindsight is very useful. You compare it to who got fired last year when they all got killed, and that's when you had Scott Parker, Bruno Lage, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Jesse Marsch, managers like this who we don't think of as being incredible process managers. They were shown the door.
Sure, they're out of there.
They're gone. But now you've got all good ones.
We say this a lot, but if you look at the list, I don't think we've got it, but if you look at the list of managers from 10 years ago in the Premier League, it's shockingly bad in comparison. We didn't know then, but now we know.
Yeah, and it comes back to money, right? Like the finances of the Premier League are able to pull coaches across from around Europe now, and so we're seeing coaches like Oliver Glasner coming into the Premier League. We saw Julian Lopetegui being linked with West Ham and potentially turning down other bigger clubs in order to get into the Premier League as well.
Yeah.
So this is all part of the PSR reality that we live in. Clubs have to be more financially sustainable because as soon as you mess up one window, then it impacts your club for the next 3 years, right? So what we're seeing, I think, now is clubs being more willing to try, especially in the bottom half of the table, to try and get upside from bringing in smart up-and-coming managers, taking the risk that maybe it won't work, but as we're seeing, actually getting the benefit. De Zerbi, Iraola, Glasner, Marco Silva. This is starting to become a reality.
Well, that financial pull is presumably one of the symptoms for similar problems happening across Europe, John.
Yeah, and I think Barcelona are the really interesting example here because they've got Xavi Hernandez as their coach right now. He was stepping down at the end of the season, seems to have reversed his decision in recent weeks when the club have started doing a little bit better. And like Premier League sides as well, they have financial issues to contend with, FFP-like problems, the cost controls that La Liga have in place, means that they can't just get rid of managers, bring new managers in, because those things cost money, and so they're being more careful from a financial point of view. And I think by dint of that fact, what we're starting to see then is like the pool of clubs that can hire elite managers is being slightly narrowed, but also that set of managers who could potentially take that kind of job has narrowed as well, because Julian Nagelsmann has stayed in the international game where he had the option of maybe moving back into the domestic football leagues. And so again, you're getting reduction of the amount of clubs that maybe are looking for these elite managers, but also a reduction of the managers who are available in that situation.
Well, I mean, that brings us all the way around to Bayern Munich, John, who they're in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, they're another flashpoint, right? Because what we've seen from Bayern is an inability to get maybe the manager that they would ideally want to get in this situation. And so they've been working their way through various managers, some of whom have turned them down and others of whom haven't been available.
Well, let's hear about that process right now from the Athletic's very own Seb Stafford-Bloor, who's here to give us the timeline of manager search. I was trying to think of a more dramatic term, but there isn't one really, is there? It's just a manager search. But here's all the people they looked at, and Seb's going to tell us who.
Bayern Munich have had a really, really strange 2024. So back in the winter, they announced that Thomas Tuchel will be leaving the club in the summer. And that's set forth a chain of events, which is still going now. First of all, Xabi Alonso said 9 to the Bayern Munich job. He is going to stay at Leverkusen and defend their Bundesliga title, lead the club into the Champions League. Julian Nagelsmann did the same. He's staying with the DFB. He wants to manage Germany for the foreseeable future. Unai Emery, he's a no too. He's very, very happy at Aston Villa. We have Roberto De Zerbi, he's staying at Brighton. He doesn't want to manage Bayern Munich. Ralf Rangnick, that was a really, really strange one. He's decided at 65 that he would rather continue to manage the Austrian national team, coaching not every few days, but every few months. That was unexpected. Erik ten Hag, no, he's not going to Germany. He would have been going back to Bayern Munich because he used to work in the youth academy there. So where are we? Don't really know. It's looking like maybe Hansi Flick, but nobody in Germany is really, really sure who Bayern are going to turn to next.
Thank you, Seb. Very long search, isn't it? It's taking It's taking a long time, and I think we've heard all the reasons why that might be the case. But in their specific case, JJ, they are an elite team, aren't they? And so they have particular issues here too. What are they looking for?
Particular issues. Well, Bayern Munich would be looking for the best manager.
Yeah.
So that's clearly what they want to get. And we can divide what all the managers in the world are into little buckets, and we can do that in a second. But like with Bayern Munich, what they really want is like the absolute best manager who's going to take them to the next level or just win things. Mm-hmm. They also tend to like someone who's got something to do with Bayern Munich, whether they've played for the club or
they're from Bavaria,
or they're like friends with them or something.
Like have to speak German as well.
Yep. Very important.
These things all help. So if you're Bayern Munich, you want the very best. And the very best are in a bucket I've called unavailable brackets right now. And that includes managers like Pep Guardiola, who's actually linked with him, Jurgen Klopp, Xabi Alonso, Mikel Arteta.
Sir Alex Ferguson.
Unavailable right now. And next to that, I have another bucket. I've called this bucket realistic, potentially available managers with experience of managing a giant club. Okay. Because what you want in Bayern Munich, ideally, someone who's an elite coach, but someone who has managed a big club, because Bayern Munich is more than just managing players on the pitch.
Yeah.
It's a huge behemoth of the thing, and it's very hard to, there's a lot to deal with here.
It's unwieldy.
Yeah, you've got a lot of pressure, you need to be able to deal with that and manage massive egos. It's a very complicated thing to do. And in that list, I've got managers like Luis Enrique, Simone Inzaghi, Hansi Flick, Mauricio Pochettino, Unai Emery, Didier Deschamps, remember him? Mm-hmm. So the people like this are all there. Then you go to Jose Mourinho, no, it's not going to be him. Not Antonio Conte, it's not going to be Zinedine Zidane, it's not going to be Stefano Pioli.
What about Unai Emery, who Seb did mention?
Yeah, I mean, he's there at the Premier League, but the Premier League is like the league to go to right now, and he's just at the start of this process that he's in now, and he might want to stay with Aston Villa to take it to wherever it might go.
Well, does Arsenal count as big club experience, like given that it didn't go very well?
Well, he also managed Paris Saint-Germain.
Oh, so he did.
Yeah, and he won the UEFA, the Europa League with Sevilla a few times as well. Yeah, well, they're not super club, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you go down that list, we get to players like, managers like Ronald Koeman. No, it's not going to be him. And then you start working your way down to clubs like in England, Manchester United. Then you start going, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Yeah. Maybe not. David Moyes. Maybe not. Erik ten Hag. These are all managers who have managed at this high level. Yeah. And so then if it's not in that group of managers, you see all the pros and cons to all of these, you go into an up-and-comer. So who are the next managers on the list that are going to take you to the next level? You bank on them early. And then you get managers like Seb Hoeneß at Stuttgart, who just signed a new deal, so he's not going to Bayern now, that's why he's unavailable. Thiago Motta, maybe, but does it scale? Does it really work elsewhere? Ruben Amorim, done very well in Portugal. And then we end on this list with Roberto De Zerbi, who everyone's really hot on very, very recently, but all of a sudden isn't the talk of the town.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? What is that with Roberto De Zerbi? Because as JJ says, I feel like last calendar year, we were all tipping him for the next big job. We were saying, oh, look, if Pep Guardiola leaves Manchester City, or he's definitely going to Bayern Munich. He doesn't seem to be going anywhere. What's happening?
Yeah, and what we're talking about here, I think, is risk, because there's certain things that Roberto De Zerbi does that has attracted elite clubs, because he's doing something with, I guess, mid-table squad to make them look like they can compete at the highest level in certain areas. The big question is whether or not you can scale that up. But in order to explore what those ideas are, it's probably best for us to break down what it is that Bayern Munich do. Brighton do.
Brighton, John, it's Brighton.
It is Brighton.
Yes.
Well, I think the thing that has attracted elite clubs to De Zerbi is the fact that he is able to do the sorts of things that elite teams want, particularly in possession of the ball. But he does it in a slightly interesting way that I think maybe adds upside to certain teams. We can go on to talk about some of the teams that this might work with later. But when we're talking about elite teams in possession, what we've seen from teams like Arsenal, Man City, what they want to do is possess the ball more than their opponents, and they want to do that by squeezing their opponents into their own penalty box, into their own third. That does a couple of things. One, it makes it more likely for you to have the ball in an area where you can score, but also it keeps the opposition away from your own goal. So the theory is, with elite players, if you are going to be able to have the ball in those kind of areas, eventually you are going to be able to score goals. Now, De Zerbi doesn't have that available to him because he has a lower ceiling in terms of talent and technical quality in his squad. And so what he does is he actually flips this logic on its head, and he says, well, if we aren't going to be able to break down low blocks, why create low blocks in the way that Man City and Arsenal do? Why not just avoid that completely, and let's try and possess the ball deeper in the pitch, further away from the goal, because this gives us a few advantages. One of them is that it's easier to possess the ball away from the opponent in your own half, because there's just more space available to you. So if you have less technical players, you are able to, you should be able to possess the ball better in these sorts of situations. But the other thing that this does is that it has this capacity then, if you're going to bait the opposition forward into pressing you because you're holding the ball deep in your half, you're actually doing the opposite of what clubs like Man City and Arsenal are doing, because you're creating then space that you can attack. And the whole idea behind what De Zerbi is doing is that he's creating these scenarios where they know how to build up the ball through the lines of pressure, and eventually they're going to be able to hit these passes into wide players coming out to in runs, and there should be a lot of space for them to attack. So they have players like March and Mitoma who are able to attack in these artificial transition moments.
He's stacking the deck. I don't know if you've noticed, but he's stacking the deck for his prediction recommendation later, JJ. Viewers at home, just have a think about who John's going to recommend De Zerbi goes to. Carry on, John.
Yes.
I can't work it out.
There's a couple of problems that have happened this season, so they've had a few setbacks in a few key areas. One of which is the wide forwards that they've been using, Mitoma, March, have both been injured for big spells of this season. So they're playing a system which is reliant on creating space for these two players. They've not been available, so obviously that makes things a little bit more difficult. But the other aspect of this that is interesting is that because Brighton are so devastating in these transitional moments, is that teams are like, well, it takes two to tango here, so we have to press high in order for there to be space. So what if we just refuse the space, right? And the problem then is, as we said before, if Brighton don't have the players who can break down those low blocks, they don't have the technical ability in their squad to do that, then they are going to struggle. But there comes another problem here too, and that is that they are now able to easily possess the ball in these higher areas, but they've got the opposite problem, exactly the problem they're trying to provoke in other teams, which is they are now quite vulnerable to the space in behind. And this season, they've got Gross and Gilmour in that double pivot in the build-up. That's great, because they're two of the best technical build-up players in the Premier League outside of the top six. But from a defensive point of view, much weaker than Moises Caicedo and Alexis McAllister, who both sold last summer, went to elite clubs last summer, and now they're much more vulnerable in defensive transition. So you now have these two problems, one of which is breaking down low blocks, the other of which is defending in transition, which is the problems that Man City and Arsenal have to face all the time. So this is why clubs are interested in De Zerbi, because he's able to create these conditions.
And maybe Brighton have just been worked out a little bit.
Yeah, there are questions about how whether or not these are bigger issues in terms of scalability then. So can we solve these problems by moving him to a more elite club? Now, both of these issues that we're talking about here can be solved by being able to buy better players, right? If you have better players, you can you can bring in those players who are going to be good in transition, but also good in tight spaces. So you can break down low blocks. You're also going to be able to bring in your Rodris, your Declan Rices in order to sit in the midfield and cover those defensive transition moments. So scalability in that sense isn't really an issue, because you would think at a better club you can solve some of these problems. But another problem that we could talk about here is that De Zerbi is quite a scripted coach. So a lot of the build up to get through lines of pressure when they're sitting deep, they're based on just really clear ideas about which pass you should play, who should move where.
Automatons.
Yeah, automatons. And that becomes a question, right? Does he have the flexibility then, when he is at an elite club, to be able to change things up every season? The reason why Pep Guardiola is the greatest manager of all time from a tactical point of view is because he has the ability every year to change his tactics up to push back against the way that teams find them out. So I think there's a legitimate question there about whether or not De Zerbi is the coach who is able to be that flexible, or if he's too idealistic as well. And then, look, we're only talking about what's happening on the field here. This is a purely tactical point of view, and managers don't simply have to manage on the field, they have to manage off the field as well. And I think there's questions about, I think De Zerbi is quite a prickly character in press conferences. I think that he's probably quite hard to work with because he's so idealistic as well. And so maybe working in an elite environment, those could be raised as questions as well. But I do think that when it comes to scalability, it is worth a club trying him out and seeing whether or not it works, because a lot of in this respect, like, you can only really test the cake by eating it.
Well, and there's one club that you think should scoff the cake, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I think that the way that he plays football would really suit a club like Manchester United, because as we talked about, like, a lot of this is about
points for those who guessed that at home, by the way.
As we were talking about before, this is all about generating transitional moments, and Erik ten Hag this season has said he wants to make Manchester United the best transitional team in the world. In part, that's because of the players that he has. So to bring someone like De Zerbi in, you would be playing transitional football, but I think an elite form of that, because it's about ball possession. It's not about what you usually have to do when you play transitional football, which is allow the opposition to have the ball, win it back, and then transition. This is about generating, as we call, artificial transition, so with possession of the ball and then finding that space. But also, I think one of the things that is really good about De Zerbi is that he's a really good technical coach. So he takes players who you wouldn't think would be able to perform in tight spaces and in build-up environments and do progressive passes. Lewis Dunk's a great example of that. No one thought of him as being, part of a really intricate build-up team, and he's able to coach the details with them, make them better than they were before. And I think, we've seen Ten Hag struggle to get his team to build up well. I think that you would get a big upside from someone like De Zerbi being able to increase the technical capacity of his players with the system as well. So yeah, it's just a big question about whether or not the more negative aspects that we talked about would actually lead to his undoing. But if he could get more out of the squad, they could start winning more. A lot of that stuff, I think, goes away anyway. So yeah, this is why it's a risk. This is why he's not an elite club right now. But this is why an elite club should maybe take a gamble on him.
Sticking with Man United specifically, though, it's tough. A tough environment for them as well. If it's not De Zerbi, where are they looking? Let's go back to the buckets.
Well, they'd have to look in the buckets, and they'll find themselves in exactly the same position as Bayern Munich. They want someone who can manage a massive, huge, behemoth club. And so your unavailable ones are still unavailable. Then you start looking at the ones who've managed a big club, but have experience of it, and they're still good coaches, but maybe not just quite there. And that's when you start looking at managers like Erik ten Hag. They've already got him.
Yeah.
Solskjaer, he's gone. What are you going to do? Then look at the up-and-comers. Maybe they're the answer, but they don't have the experience of managing a huge club. So how about you look at someone who's managed at a very high level, maybe doesn't have the tactical excitement of other coaches, but would bring like a safe head in there, might be able to manage some of the difficult scenarios within the dressing room and in the club. And then you start looking at managers like Gareth Southgate. Maybe he's the answer. Graham Potter. Maybe he's the answer. So if you're Man United, maybe you look and to replicate what you did back in 1986 when you hire someone who is outperforming way above his station, like Sir Alex Ferguson was when he was winning European Cup Winners' Cup final against Real Madrid 2-1 with Aberdeen.
Yeah, laughably above his station.
Yeah, so Aberdeen massively overachieved. It's unbelievable what they did. He broke a duopoly, turned them into a big club. Still are, somehow. Now, what you have there is a manager obviously overperforming. Who's like that now? There's no one really around. You could say like back in 2003 or whenever it was, Jose Mourinho's sort of similar, massively overperforming with Porto. There's no one really around now at that level who's available. Xabi Alonso would be an example of someone who's doing that right now, but not available. So then you look at someone closer to home who's overperforming in very close to where Manchester is, and you start looking at Kieran McKenna at Ipswich. But you look at what Kieran McKenna is doing. Of course, he was assistant managing at Man United before. Back to my very early point about how well-run clubs are now. Ipswich were bought by Game Changer, put in loads of money, so they're a good squad in League One. They have this clear strategy and vision, and they're building players and a team around the coach, who's obviously very good at what he's doing. And so that has worked. The structure of the business is successful and works well, and so they keep moving up and up. And so McKenna is now benefiting from having that structure around him, which makes him look really, really good. There could be loads of managers who might benefit from having that structure around them that we just don't know about, and that's part of the risk of who you hire and who you fire. So where do you want to get risk of a manager? He might actually be really good, but the structure's not quite there.
It's one. I always think this with Hollywood actors, JJ, where are they excellent actors or are they just excellent at picking film?
Do you have any examples?
No.
He does.
Yeah, I mean, the Manchester United one is really interesting. I think just slightly beyond Bayern Munich, it's the best example of why Ten Hag is still, I think, in the job. Because I think if you were running Manchester United right now, what do you? It really is a hard question to answer. What do you do? John, is this a general shift? Is this an outlier season? Is this something we're going to continue to see, do you think? Because some of the examples we've heard are things that maybe will change permanently as opposed to just temporarily.
Well, we talked about last season, a ton of managers being fired. And then this season, not many being fired at all. And I think the big question is whether or not that's just the one season where, because there were so many managers turned over last season,
everyone reset their cycle.
Yeah, they've reset their cycle and everyone's relatively happy. Whether or not that means we start trending back up again, I don't know. But part of me does think that, as we've been talking about the financial concerns that clubs now have to deal with, it feels like, this is the season where teams have started getting points deductions for it. This is the season where teams are being made aware of the fact that from a financial point, you have to be long-termist and you have to be sustainable. I think that maybe that will result in fewer manager sackings going forward. But again, it could just be a one-off and we'll have to wait and see to find out.
What do you think?
Yes.
There we go.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and Rafa Honigstein. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.